In this video, I will show you how to evaluate logarithmic expressions without using a calculator. But first, you have to understand what a logarithm is. A logarithm is just an exponent. Let that sink in. A logarithm is an exponent. What exponent is it? It's the exponent that turns this number into this number. So you should be thinking to yourself, 4 to what power is equal to 64? And whatever that is, that's the value of this logarithmic expression. So because 4 to the third power is equal to 64, then the value of this expression is simply 3. Looking at problem number 2, this looks a little more confusing with all these fractions. But to help you understand, imagine that you did the reciprocal of each of these. And ignore the ones for a second. Now ask yourself what exponent would turn this number into this number. All right, so it's probably pretty obvious to you that 5 squared is 25. Okay, so with that in mind, think would the same thing apply to 1/5. All right, so what exponent will turn 1/5 into 1/25? All right, what power would it take to do that? Well, wouldn't that be the same thing? Wouldn't it still be an exponent of 2? Because 1/5 squared would be 1/25. So the value of this is 2. All right, looking at number 3. As these numbers get larger, you're going to be presented with some numbers that you may or may not know the answer to in your head. 7 to what power? What power turns 7 into 343? Maybe you don't know that one. While you won't have a calculator, you will be given access to an exponent table like this one. So what power turns what power turns 7 into 343? So looking at this chart, you have 7, and then this is 7 squared, and then 7 to the third power. So clearly it's the third power that turns 7 into 343. All right, that's why the answer to this one is going to be 3. What power turns 5 into 25? 2. All right, number 5 is slightly more interesting. What power turns 4 into 1/2? To help you discover this, for a moment, ignore the 1. So ask yourself this question. What power turns 4 into 2? So at first, you might be confused because exponents we think of as making things bigger. 4 squared is 16. How is it going to become smaller? But then remember that there is a such thing as fractional exponents, like 1/2 and 1/3 and 1/4. So remember that this means, so for example, 4 to the 1/2 power means the square root of 4. And 4 to the 1/3 power means the cube root of 4. All right, these types of things will make the number get smaller. So ask yourself, what root will turn 4 into a 2? And when you find yourself realizing that the square root of 4 is equal to 2, then that means 4 to the 1/2 power is equal to 2. I don't want you to have to write this down every time. I want you just to get comfortable with the fact that square root and 1/2 power, they're just different ways of writing the same thing. So when you ask yourself 4 to what power is 2, you should automatically start thinking, oh, that'll be the 1/2 power because that's the square root. So now you understand that if this had been the problem, if the problem were just log base 4 of 2, which is, by the way, that's the way you read this, log base 4 of 2, then the answer would be 1/2. But that wasn't the actual problem. we do have this 1 here that I temporarily covered up just to make a point. So how will this 1 change things? Now the bottom line is going to be that because it's 1 over this, the answer is going to be negative instead of positive. And the best way for me to explain that is for me just to demonstrate. So I'm claiming now that the answer is negative 1/2. So we're supposed to be finding 4 to what power is equal to 1/2. And I'm claiming that the answer is negative 1/2. Well, let's check that out and see. What happens if I do 4 to the negative 1/2 power? Well, because it's a negative exponent, that is going to drop the whole problem down to the denominator. All right, the negative 1/2 power doesn't make the problem negative. It makes it 1 over 4 to the 1/2 power. Okay, and then, as we already discussed, 1/2 power is just the square root. So this is going to be 1 over the square root of 4. So that's going to be 1 over 2. And that is exactly what we wanted to happen. So the bottom line is this. When one of these two things has a 1 over it, just cover up the 1, answer the question, and whatever you get, it's going to be negative. And then you can check it if you want to convince yourself why it works. So negative 1/2, that's the answer. So number 6, let's try that shortcut again. Cover up the 1. What power turns 7 into 49? Well, that would be 7 squared. So because it's 1 over 49, the answer should be negative 2. And one more time, you can just check your answer. If the answer is negative 2, then this should be the power that turns 7 into 1/49th. So let's see. If I do 7 to the negative 2 power, that's 1 over 7 squared, which is 1 over 49, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so the shortcut works. Okay, what power turns 2 into a 4? Well, 2 squared is 4, so that's easy. All right, number 8 is going to require some different technology. There's no direct answer that will turn 25 into 125 or 125 into 25. There's no, how do I say this? It's 25 squared or anything like that will not turn this into 125. So there's no simple thing like the square root or the cube root or the fourth root that's going to turn 125 into 25. Now that doesn't mean there's not an answer, it's just going to be a more complex answer than 2 or 3 or 4 or 1/2 or 1/3 or 1/4. It'll be more complicated than these. So we're going to use something called the change of base formula. All right, the change of base formula says that you can take a logarithm like this and rewrite it as a fraction. It's going to be the log of the second number divided by the log of the first number. Okay, now the wonderful thing about this is you can use any base here that you want. So I'm going to think about what base these two numbers have in common. So for example, 25 and 125 can both be written as base 5. What I mean is 5 squared is 25 and 5 to the third power is 125. So because these can both be written as base 5, then that's the base I'm going to use for both of these. Because now I can easily evaluate the numerator and I can easily evaluate the denominator. Okay, so what power turns 5 into 25? That's 2. What power turns 5 into 125? That's 3. So that's going to be the answer to number 8. And if you didn't know that 5 to the third power is 125, again, that's your chart working for you right there. All right, what power turns 4 into 16? That's 2. What power turns 2 into 32? That's 5. You might not have known that by heart, but look at the chart. 2 to the 5th power is 32. What power turns 1/7 into 1/49th? Well, we know that 7 squared is 49, so the answer is going to be 2, because 1/7 squared would be 1/49th. What power turned 7 into 343? Wasn't this a problem we already did? That's 3. 7 to the third power is 343. What power turns 64 into 1/4? Well, cover up the 1 and ask yourself the question now. And then whatever we get, the answer should be negative. So what power turns 64 into 4? Well, you see that it's getting smaller. So this must be a fractional power. Is it the square root or is it the cube root? Well, turns out the cube root of 64 is 4. So that means 64 to the 1/3 power is 4. So what power turns 64 into 4? The 1/3 power. So since it is actually 1/4, then that means it must be the negative 1/3 power that we need. If you didn't know that the cube root of 64 was 4, you could get that off the chart. The cube root of 64 is 4. For the root, you go backwards. And if you wanted just to convince yourself that this is really the answer, you can always check your work, check your answer. We are claiming that this is the power that turns 64 into 1/4. Well, let's see. Let's take 64 to the negative 1/3 power and see what happens. Well, the first thing that happens is that this will become 1/64 to the 1/3 power, because that's what a negative exponent does. And this is going to become, well, this is the cube root of 64. That's what the 1/3 power means. And the cube root of 64 is 4. So we end up getting 1/4, which is just what we said we would get. What power turns 7 into 1/343? Well, ignore the 1, find the answer, and then it should be negative. So 7 to the third power is 343. So the answer must be negative 3. Okay, and just one more time, you could check that and see what is 7 to the negative 3 power. Well, that would be 1/7 to the third power, which would be 1/343, just like we thought. What power turns 6 into 36? Well, that's 2. What power turns 2 into 1/4? Well, cover up the 1, and then whatever answer you get now, just make it negative. 2 squared is 4. So the answer must be negative 2. All right, number 17 is another one that we will need the change of base formula for. There's no one number that will turn 49 into 343. So let's use the change of base formula. This would be the same thing as the log of 49 over the log of 343. Now we can use any base that we want. So what is the base that these have in common? Well, 49 can be written as 7 squared, and 343 is 7 to the third power. So they both can be written using base 7. So let's use base 7. So now we can do the problem. What power turns 7 into 49? That's 2, 7 squared. What power turns 7 into 343? Well, that's 3. Okay, so the final answer is 2/3. You know what? We can check that answer as well. All right, it's always good to have the power to check your answer. So we are claiming that 343 to the 2/3 power should equal 49. Let's see. Remember, when you have a fractional power, that's always in the form power over root. So this means that 3 is the root. So this is the cube root of 343. And 2 is the power. So the cube root of 343 is 7. And then 7 squared is 49, which is exactly what we were saying we would get. What power turns 3 into 243? I don't have that one memorized yet, so let me look at the chart. 3, and then there's 243, so that's the 5th power. Okay, so the answer is 5. What power turns 2 into 1/16? Well, cover up the 1, and whatever the answer is, it should be negative. So what power turns 2 into 16? 2 to the 4th power is 16. So the answer must be -4. This one's curious. What power turns 3 into a 1? Well, anything to the 0 power is 1. So the answer must be 0. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. Go ahead and click here in the red apple to watch the next video. Click in the green apple to subscribe, or click the yellow apple for the full playlist.